In the year 711, as dawn broke over the narrow strait separating Africa from Europe, a small fleet of ships carried warriors who would forever alter the course of Iberian civilization. The Visigothic kingdom of Hispania, which had ruled the peninsula for nearly 3 centuries, stood on the precipice of collapse. Internal strife had weakened the monarchy, with rival claimants to the throne engaging in bitter civil wars that drained the kingdom's resources and divided its nobility. King Roderick, the last Visigothic ruler, faced challenges not only from external enemies but from within his own court, where ambitious nobles plotted against his authority and questioned his legitimacy. The catalyst for invasion came from an unexpected quarter. Count Julian, the Visigothic governor of Ceuta on the North African coast, harbored deep resentment against King Roderick following a personal affront involving the king's alleged assault on Julian's daughter while she served at the royal court. This grievance, whether factual or fabricated by later chroniclers seeking to explain the rapid collapse of Christian resistance, provided the justification for Julian's fateful decision to invite Muslim forces across the strait. The Islamic world at this time was experiencing unprecedented expansion under the Umayyad Caliphate, which had extended its dominion from the Arabian Peninsula across North Africa to the Atlantic Ocean. The recent conquest of the Maghreb had brought the Muslim armies to the very edge of Europe, where they encountered the fortress city of Ceuta. Rather than face a prolonged siege, Count Julian chose collaboration over resistance, opening his gates to the Muslim commander Musa ibn Nusair and offering his services as a guide to the treasures of Hispania. The initial Muslim expedition consisted of merely 400 men under the command of Tarif Abu Zura, who conducted a reconnaissance raid across the strait in 710. The success of this preliminary operation convinced Musa ibn Nusair to authorize a larger invasion force. In April 711, a mixed army of Arabs and Berbers numbering approximately 7,000 warriors crossed the narrow waters under the leadership of Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Berber convert to Islam who served as Musa's most trusted lieutenant. The landing site chosen by Tariq became known as Jabal Tariq, the Mountain of Tariq, which later evolved into the name Gibraltar. This imposing limestone promontory provided an excellent defensive position from which to establish a beachhead and launch operations into the interior of the peninsula. The symbolic significance of this location cannot be overstated, as it represented the first permanent Muslim foothold on European soil and the gateway through which Islamic civilization would flow into the western reaches of the known world. The rapid advance of Tariq's forces through Andalusia demonstrated the fundamental weakness of Visigothic military organization and the extent of popular dissatisfaction with the existing order. Many cities opened their gates without resistance, while others fell after brief sieges. The Jewish communities, who had suffered persecution under Visigothic rule, often welcomed the Muslim invaders as liberators, providing intelligence and assistance that proved invaluable to the advancing armies. King Roderick, upon learning of the invasion, marshaled his forces and marched south to confront the Muslim threat. The decisive encounter occurred near the Guadalete River in July 711, where the two armies met in a battle that would determine the fate of Christian Hispania. Contemporary accounts describe a fierce engagement lasting several days, during which the superior mobility and archery skills of the Muslim cavalry gradually wore down the Visigothic heavy infantry. The critical moment came when several Visigothic nobles, including the brothers of the previous king Witiza, defected to the Muslim side during the height of battle. This treachery, motivated by their long-standing opposition to Roderick's rule, caused the Christian battle line to collapse in confusion and panic. King Roderick himself disappeared during the fighting, his fate remaining a mystery that would inspire legends and songs for centuries to come. Some accounts claim he died fighting valiantly against overwhelming odds, while others suggest he fled the battlefield and lived as a hermit, consumed by guilt over the loss of his kingdom. The victory at Guadalete opened the entire peninsula to Muslim conquest. Tariq's forces advanced rapidly toward the Visigothic capital of Toledo, which surrendered without resistance in late 711. The capture of this ancient city, with its royal treasury and administrative apparatus intact, provided the Muslims with the resources and legitimacy needed to establish permanent control over their conquests. Meanwhile, Musa ibn Nusair, concerned that his subordinate might claim excessive credit for the conquest, crossed into Hispania with an additional army of 18,000 men, mostly Arabs from Syria and Yemen. The relationship between Musa and Tariq grew increasingly strained as both commanders sought to maximize their personal glory and influence with the caliph in Damascus. This rivalry would establish a pattern of internal conflict among Muslim rulers that would persist throughout the Islamic period in Iberia. The combined Muslim forces continued their expansion throughout 712 and 713, capturing major cities including Seville, Merida, and Zaragoza. The speed of these conquests reflected not only Muslim military prowess but also the collapse of organized Christian resistance following the disaster at Guadalete. Many Visigothic nobles fled to the mountainous regions of the north, while others chose to collaborate with the new rulers in hopes of preserving their lands and privileges. The administrative structure established by the Muslim conquerors demonstrated remarkable pragmatism and efficiency. Rather than imposing wholesale changes, they adopted and adapted existing Visigothic institutions, retaining local administrators who proved competent and loyal. Christians and Jews, as people of the book, were granted protected status as dhimmis, allowing them to practice their religions in exchange for payment of special taxes and acceptance of certain social restrictions. The economic impact of the Muslim conquest proved largely beneficial for the peninsula's population. The new rulers introduced advanced agricultural techniques developed in the arid regions of the Middle East and North Africa, including sophisticated irrigation systems that dramatically increased crop yields. The introduction of new crops such as rice, sugarcane, and citrus fruits diversified agricultural production and improved nutrition for urban and rural populations alike. Trade networks that had been disrupted by Visigothic political instability were quickly restored and expanded under Muslim rule. The peninsula became integrated into the vast commercial system of the Islamic world, stretching from Spain to Central Asia and the Indian Ocean. Cities like Córdoba and Seville emerged as major commercial centers, attracting merchants from across the Mediterranean and establishing the foundations for centuries of prosperity. The cultural transformation that began with the Muslim conquest would prove even more profound than the political and economic changes. The Arabic language gradually spread throughout the conquered territories, becoming the medium of administration, scholarship, and literature. While the majority of the population retained their Romance dialects, which would eventually evolve into Spanish, Portuguese, and Catalan, Arabic vocabulary and linguistic structures profoundly influenced these emerging languages. Islamic architectural styles began to appear in major cities, blending traditional Arab and Byzantine elements with local Visigothic and Roman traditions. The Great Mosque of Córdoba, begun in 785, exemplifies this architectural synthesis, featuring horseshoe arches derived from Visigothic models, alternating red and white voussoirs inspired by Byzantine examples, and overall proportions reflecting Islamic aesthetic principles. The intellectual life of the peninsula flourished under the early Muslim rulers, who established libraries, schools, and centers of learning that attracted scholars from across the Islamic world. The translation movement, which sought to preserve and transmit Greek philosophical and scientific texts, found enthusiastic support among the educated elite of Al-Andalus, as Muslim Iberia came to be known. However, the rapid success of the Muslim conquest should not obscure the fact that Christian resistance never entirely ceased. In the remote valleys of the Cantabrian Mountains and the Pyrenees, small groups of Visigothic nobles and their followers maintained their independence and began the long process of organizing counterattacks against Muslim rule. The most significant of these early resistance movements centered around a Visigothic nobleman named Pelayo, who established himself in the mountainous region of Asturias around 718. The details of Pelayo's background remain disputed among historians, with some sources claiming he was a member of the Visigothic royal family, while others suggest he was a relatively minor noble who rose to prominence through his military skills and charismatic leadership. The legendary Battle of Covadonga, fought around 722, marked the first significant Christian victory against Muslim forces and became the founding myth of the Reconquista. According to later Christian chroniclers, Pelayo and a small band of followers took refuge in a cave near Covadonga, where they were besieged by a large Muslim army commanded by Alcama. Through divine intervention, the Virgin Mary allegedly caused the Muslims' arrows to turn back upon themselves, while a landslide destroyed their forces and killed their commander. Modern historians debate the historical accuracy of these accounts, noting that contemporary Muslim sources barely mention the engagement and suggest it was little more than a minor skirmish in a remote mountain valley. However, the symbolic importance of Covadonga far exceeded its immediate military significance, providing Christian resistance movements with a powerful origin story and establishing the precedent for future campaigns justified as religious crusades. Pelayo's success in maintaining independence in Asturias encouraged other Christian holdouts throughout the northern mountains. The Kingdom of Asturias gradually expanded its territory through a combination of military conquest and diplomatic negotiation, establishing control over much of the Cantabrian coast and the headwaters of the Duero River. The early Asturian kings adopted a consciously Neo-Visigothic ideology, claiming to be the legitimate heirs of the defunct kingdom and the rightful rulers of all Hispania. This claim provided powerful motivation for continued resistance and expansion, while also establishing the legal and political framework for the eventual reconquest of the entire peninsula. Alfonso I, who ruled Asturias from 739 to 757, proved to be the most successful of the early Christian resistance leaders. His military campaigns extended Asturian control deep into the Duero basin, while his administrative reforms established the institutional foundations for sustained territorial expansion. Alfonso's strategy of conducting frequent raids into Muslim territory, destroying fortifications and depopulating border regions, created a buffer zone that protected the Christian heartland while gradually weakening Muslim defenses. The Muslim response to Christian resistance efforts was initially limited and ineffective. The Umayyad governors, preoccupied with internal conflicts and the challenges of administering their vast conquests, devoted insufficient resources to eliminating the northern Christian enclaves. This strategic oversight would prove costly in the long term, as it allowed Christian resistance movements to establish secure bases and develop the military capabilities necessary for major offensive operations. The establishment of the Emirate of Córdoba in 756 marked a new phase in the political development of Muslim Iberia. Abd al-Rahman I, a survivor of the Abbasid massacre of the Umayyad dynasty in Damascus, succeeded in establishing an independent state that would endure for nearly 3 centuries. This political revolution had profound implications for Christian-Muslim relations on the peninsula, as it created a powerful centralized state capable of mounting sustained military campaigns against the northern kingdoms. The architectural achievements of the early Emirate period reflect the cultural confidence and economic prosperity of Muslim Iberia. The expansion of the Great Mosque of Córdoba under Abd al-Rahman I transformed the building into one of the largest and most magnificent religious structures in the Islamic world. The mosque's forest of columns, created by incorporating hundreds of Roman and Visigothic capitals, demonstrated the ability of Islamic architects to adapt and transform earlier architectural traditions. The social structure that emerged in Al-Andalus during the 8th and 9th centuries was characterized by remarkable diversity and complexity. The Muslim population itself was divided into several distinct groups, including Arabs who claimed descent from the original conquerors, Berbers from North Africa, and Mullahs, Christians who had converted to Islam. Each group maintained its own identity and interests, leading to frequent conflicts that weakened Muslim unity and provided opportunities for Christian expansion. The Christian population of Al-Andalus, known as Mozarabs, developed a unique cultural synthesis that blended Islamic and Christian elements. These communities maintained their religious practices while adopting Arabic language and Islamic customs, creating a distinctive form of Christianity that would influence Christian development throughout the peninsula. The Jewish communities of Al-Andalus experienced what many historians consider a golden age of intellectual and cultural achievement. Freed from the restrictions and persecutions they had suffered under Visigothic rule, Jewish scholars made significant contributions to philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and literature. The works of figures like Hasdai ibn Shaprat and later Maimonides would influence Jewish thought throughout Europe and the Mediterranean world. Agricultural innovations introduced by Muslim settlers transformed the landscape and economy of the peninsula. The extensive irrigation systems developed in the valleys of Andalusia, particularly around cities like Granada and Seville, supported intensive cultivation of crops that had been unknown in Visigothic times. These technological advances not only increased agricultural productivity but also supported larger urban populations and more complex economic structures. The urban development that occurred under early Muslim rule established patterns that would endure throughout the medieval period. Cities like Córdoba, Seville, and Granada became major centers of commerce, manufacturing, and intellectual activity, attracting populations from throughout the Mediterranean world. The urban planning principles employed in these cities, with their networks of narrow streets, central marketplaces, and integrated residential and commercial districts, reflected Islamic urban traditions adapted to local conditions. The military organization of the early emirate combined traditional Arab cavalry tactics with infantry formations drawn from Berber and Muladi populations. The professional corps of the army consisted of Syrian regiments that had accompanied Abd al-Rahman I in his conquest of the peninsula, while militia forces provided local defense and supported major campaigns. This military system proved effective in maintaining internal order and defending against Christian attacks, though it would face increasing challenges as Christian military capabilities improved. The intellectual and cultural developments of the early Emirate period established Al-Andalus as one of the leading centers of Islamic civilization. The court at Córdoba attracted poets, scholars, and artists from throughout the Islamic world, while local schools and libraries preserved and transmitted classical knowledge. The synthesis of Islamic, Christian, and Jewish intellectual traditions that emerged during this period would profoundly influence European thought and culture. As the 8th century drew to a close, the basic patterns of medieval Iberian civilization had been established. The peninsula was divided between an expanding Christian kingdom in the north and a sophisticated Muslim emirate in the south, with both societies developing distinctive cultural and political identities. The stage was set for 8 centuries of intermittent warfare, cultural exchange, and gradual Christian advance that would culminate in the fall of Granada and the completion of the Reconquista. The reign of Alfonso II of Asturias, who ruled from 791 to 842, marked a significant expansion of Christian territorial control and the development of more sophisticated military and administrative institutions. Alfonso's campaigns extended Asturian control to the city of Leon and established permanent settlements in the upper Duero Valley, creating a buffer zone that protected the Christian heartland from Muslim counterattacks. The discovery of the supposed tomb of St. James the Apostle at Compostela during Alfonso's reign provided Asturian Christianity with a powerful patron saint and pilgrimage destination. The development of the Camino de Santiago, the pilgrimage route to Compostela, would have profound cultural and economic implications for Christian Iberia, connecting the northern kingdoms to the broader currents of European Christianity and providing a source of revenue and cultural exchange. The military reforms implemented by Alfonso II reflected the growing sophistication of Christian resistance efforts. The development of heavy cavalry formations, modeled on Frankish examples, provided Christian armies with greater tactical flexibility and offensive capability. The construction of fortified settlements and castles throughout the frontier regions created a defensive network that could support sustained territorial expansion. The cultural renaissance that occurred in Asturias during this period demonstrated the vitality of Christian civilization in the peninsula. The construction of churches like Santa Maria del Naranco and San Miguel de Lillo showcased a distinctive architectural style that combined Visigothic traditions with Carolingian influences. These buildings served not only religious functions but also political purposes, asserting Christian cultural supremacy and providing visible symbols of royal authority. The administrative innovations of the Asturian monarchy established the institutional foundations for future territorial expansion. The development of royal councils, legal codes, and bureaucratic structures enabled the efficient governance of newly conquered territories, while maintaining the loyalty of diverse populations. The integration of Visigothic legal traditions with new administrative practices created a flexible system of government that could adapt to changing circumstances. The economic development of Christian territories during the 9th century reflected both the challenges and opportunities created by the frontier situation. The constant threat of Muslim raids necessitated defensive preparations that consumed significant resources, while the capture of Muslim towns and territories provided new sources of wealth and population. The development of agricultural techniques suited to the northern climate and terrain enabled the support of larger populations and more complex social structures. The relationship between Christian and Muslim territories was characterized by a complex mixture of warfare, diplomacy, and economic exchange. Despite the ideological conflicts that divided the peninsula, practical considerations often led to temporary alliances and cooperative arrangements. Christian nobles sometimes allied with Muslim rulers against their co-religionists, while Muslim commanders occasionally sought Christian assistance in their internal conflicts. The gradual development of a distinct Christian Iberian identity during the 9th century reflected the growing confidence and cultural sophistication of the northern kingdoms. The elaboration of Neo-Visigothic political theories, the cultivation of distinctive architectural and artistic styles, and the development of historical chronicles that celebrated Christian achievements all contributed to the emergence of a coherent cultural identity that would sustain the long struggle against Muslim rule. As the 9th century progressed toward its conclusion, the foundations had been laid for the next phase of the Reconquista. Christian territories had expanded significantly, military capabilities had improved, and political institutions had developed the sophistication necessary for sustained territorial conquest. The Muslim Emirates, while still powerful and culturally vibrant, faced increasing internal divisions and external pressures that would create opportunities for Christian advance. The stage was set for the dramatic developments of the 10th century, when both Christian and Muslim powers would reach new heights of achievement and the balance of power on the peninsula would begin its gradual but inexorable shift toward the north. The dawn of the 10th century witnessed the transformation of the Emirate of Córdoba into the most powerful and culturally sophisticated state in Western Europe. Abd al-Rahman III, who ascended to power in 912, inherited a realm torn by internal rebellions and threatened by both Christian expansion and Fatimid competition from North Africa. His remarkable reign, spanning nearly 50 years until his death in 961, would establish the Caliphate of Córdoba as one of the great powers of the medieval world and create a golden age of Islamic civilization in Iberia. The political challenges facing Abd al-Rahman III at the beginning of his reign were formidable and multifaceted. Muladi and Arab nobles had established virtually independent principalities throughout Al-Andalus, openly defying the authority of Córdoba and engaging in constant warfare among themselves. The Banu Qaysai family controlled much of the upper Ebro Valley, while Ibn Hafsun and his descendants maintained their rebellion from the fortress of Bobastro in the mountains of Malaga. These internal conflicts had weakened Muslim military capabilities and provided Christian kingdoms with opportunities for territorial expansion. The suppression of internal rebellions became Abd al-Rahman's first priority, requiring nearly 2 decades of sustained military campaigning. The siege of Bobastro, which lasted from 913 to 928, exemplified the emir's determination and strategic patience. Rather than attempting costly direct assaults, Abd al-Rahman systematically reduced the fortress's ability to resist by capturing surrounding strongholds, cutting supply lines, and offering generous terms to rebels willing to submit. The final surrender of Bobastro eliminated the last major center of internal resistance and demonstrated the restored power of the central government. The military reforms implemented by Abd al-Rahman III revolutionized the organization and effectiveness of Muslim armies in Iberia. The creation of a professional standing army, recruited from diverse ethnic backgrounds and loyal primarily to the ruler rather than tribal or regional affiliations, provided the caliphate with unprecedented military capabilities. Slavic Mamluks, purchased from European slave markets and trained from childhood as elite soldiers, formed the core of this new military establishment and became renowned throughout the Islamic world for their discipline and fighting prowess. The expansion of naval capabilities under Abd al-Rahman III transformed the strategic balance in the Western Mediterranean and enabled the caliphate to project power far beyond the Iberian Peninsula. The construction of new naval bases at Almeria and Seville, combined with the development of advanced shipbuilding techniques, created a formidable fleet capable of challenging Byzantine and Italian maritime dominance. Cordoban naval expeditions established bases in the Balearic Islands and conducted successful raids against the coasts of France and Italy, demonstrating the global reach of the revitalized caliphate. The assumption of the caliphal title by Abd al-Rahman III in 929 marked a decisive break with the past and established Córdoba as an independent center of Islamic authority rival to both Baghdad and Cairo. This bold political move reflected the ruler's confidence in his military and economic achievements while also serving practical diplomatic purposes by enhancing his prestige in negotiations with Christian rulers and Muslim competitors. The proclamation of the Caliphate of Córdoba sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic world and established Al-Andalus as one of the 3 major centers of Islamic civilization. The construction of the Palatine city of Madinat al-Zahra, begun around 936, represented the architectural culmination of Abd al-Rahman's reign and created one of the most magnificent royal residences in the medieval world. This vast complex, covering over 100 hectares and employing thousands of craftsmen from throughout the Islamic world, demonstrated the wealth and cultural sophistication of the Cordoban Caliphate. The palace's innovative architectural features, including advanced water management systems, sophisticated decorative programs, and integration with the surrounding landscape, influenced architectural development throughout Europe and North Africa. The cultural flowering that occurred under Abd al-Rahman III and his successors established Córdoba as the intellectual capital of Western Europe and one of the great centers of learning in the medieval world. The Caliph's library, containing over 400,000 volumes, rivaled the great libraries of Baghdad and Constantinople and attracted scholars from throughout the known world. The patronage of literature, philosophy, science, and the arts created an environment of intellectual ferment that produced groundbreaking achievements in fields ranging from medicine and mathematics to poetry and music. The court culture that developed at Córdoba synthesized influences from throughout the Islamic world while maintaining distinctive Iberian characteristics. The elaborate ceremonial protocols, refined literary traditions, and sophisticated artistic patronage created a model of Islamic courtly civilization that influenced royal courts throughout Europe. The integration of Christian and Jewish scholars into court intellectual life demonstrated the cosmopolitan character of Cordoban culture and contributed to remarkable achievements in translation, philosophy, and scientific research. Meanwhile, the Christian kingdoms of northern Iberia experienced their own period of expansion and consolidation during the 10th century. The Kingdom of Leon, which had emerged from the earlier Asturian realm, extended its control southward to the Duero River and eastward into the upper Ebro Valley. The establishment of new settlements and the construction of fortified positions along the frontier created a network of defensive strongholds that could support further territorial expansion while protecting existing Christian territories from Muslim counterattacks. The reign of Ramiro II of Leon from 931 to 951 marked the high point of 10th-century Christian military success and demonstrated the growing capability of Christian armies to challenge Muslim forces in open battle. The Battle of Simancas in 939 resulted in a devastating defeat for the forces of Abd al-Rahman III and established Christian military reputation throughout Europe. This victory, achieved through innovative tactical formations and superior battlefield leadership, proved that Christian armies could successfully confront even the most powerful Muslim forces when properly organized and commanded. The development of County of Castile as a semi-independent frontier principality reflected the distinctive character of Christian expansion in the eastern regions of the peninsula. The Castilian nobility, led by figures like Fernan González, developed a military culture particularly adapted to frontier warfare and characterized by exceptional mobility, tactical flexibility, and aggressive offensive spirit. The castle-based defensive system that gave Castile its name created a network of fortified positions that could support deep penetration raids into Muslim territory, while providing secure bases for territorial consolidation. The cultural and religious revival that occurred in Christian territories during the 10th century paralleled the political and military expansion of the northern kingdoms. The construction of magnificent churches and monasteries, including San Miguel de Escalada and Santiago de Penalba, demonstrated the growing wealth and confidence of Christian society. These architectural achievements showcased distinctive Mozarabic influences, reflecting the cultural synthesis that resulted from contact between Christian and Islamic civilizations. The development of the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela during this period created new connections between Iberian Christianity and the broader European world. The increasing number of pilgrims traveling to the shrine of St. James brought foreign influences, ideas, and resources into Christian territories while also spreading knowledge of Iberian conditions throughout Europe. The economic benefits generated by pilgrimage traffic provided Christian kingdoms with additional resources for military campaigns and territorial expansion. The monastery of San Millán de la Cogala emerged as one of the most important centers of Christian learning and culture during the 10th century. The scriptorium established at this monastery produced some of the finest illuminated manuscripts of the medieval period, including copies of Beatus of Libana's commentary on the Apocalypse that demonstrated remarkable artistic sophistication and cultural synthesis. These manuscripts not only preserved Christian learning but also incorporated artistic influences from Islamic culture, creating unique artistic expressions that reflected the complex cultural environment of medieval Iberia. The frontier society that developed along the Christian-Muslim border created distinctive social and military institutions that would profoundly influence Iberian development. The emergence of military orders, similar to those developing in the Holy Land, provided Christian kingdoms with dedicated military forces committed to perpetual warfare against Islamic rule. These organizations combined religious devotion with military service and created institutional frameworks for sustained territorial expansion. The economic development of both Christian and Muslim territories during the 10th century reflected the prosperity generated by territorial expansion, agricultural intensification, and commercial growth. The integration of newly conquered territories into existing economic systems required sophisticated administrative capabilities and created opportunities for social advancement that attracted population migration and investment. The circulation of precious metals captured in military campaigns provided both sides with the resources necessary for continued warfare and territorial expansion. The diplomatic relations between Christian and Muslim rulers during this period demonstrated remarkable complexity and pragmatism despite the ideological conflicts that theoretically divided them. Treaties, truces, and temporary alliances were frequently negotiated to address immediate tactical concerns, while tribute payments and prisoner exchanges created ongoing relationships that transcended religious boundaries. These diplomatic interactions facilitated cultural exchange and mutual learning that enriched both societies, while also providing frameworks for managing conflict. The reign of Al-Hakam II, from 961 to 976, represented the cultural zenith of the Cordoban Caliphate and created achievements in learning and scholarship that influenced intellectual development throughout Europe. The caliph's personal commitment to scholarship, reflected in his massive library and patronage of learned men, established Córdoba as the premier center of learning in Western Europe. The achievements of scholars working under Al-Hakam's patronage in fields including medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy created intellectual foundations that would influence European development for centuries. The agricultural innovations and intensification that occurred during this period transformed the productive capacity of both Christian and Muslim territories. The introduction of new crops, improvement of irrigation systems, and development of more efficient farming techniques supported larger populations and generated agricultural surpluses that could support urban growth and military expansion. The terracing of hillsides, particularly in Muslim territories, created new agricultural land while demonstrating sophisticated understanding of environmental management. The urban development that characterized the 10th century created new centers of population, commerce, and culture throughout the peninsula. Cities like Toledo, Seville, and Zaragoza emerged as major regional centers with populations reaching tens of thousands of inhabitants. The construction of markets, workshops, and residential districts reflected growing economic complexity and social differentiation, while the building of walls, towers, and defensive installations demonstrated the ongoing military challenges facing urban populations. The textile industry that developed in both Christian and Muslim territories during this period created products renowned throughout Europe for their quality and artistic sophistication. The production of silk fabrics in cities like Almeria and Granada utilized techniques and materials imported from the Islamic East, while Christian territories developed wool production that supplied markets throughout Europe. These industries provided employment for urban populations while generating export revenues that supported territorial expansion and cultural development. The intellectual achievements of Jewish communities in Al-Andalus during the 10th century established foundations for what historians consider the golden age of Spanish Jewry. Scholars like Hasdai ibn Shaprat, who served as physician and diplomat to Abd al-Rahman III, demonstrated the integration of Jewish intellectuals into the highest levels of Muslim society. The Hebrew poetry, philosophical works, and scientific treatises produced by Jewish scholars during this period influenced Jewish thought throughout Europe while also contributing to the broader intellectual culture of Al-Andalus. The military architecture that developed during the 10th century reflected the technological and tactical innovations that characterized this period of intense warfare. The construction of massive fortifications like those at Gormaz and Medinaceli created defensive systems capable of withstanding prolonged sieges while providing secure bases for offensive operations. The integration of living quarters, storage facilities, and administrative buildings within fortified complexes reflected the evolution of castle design and the growing sophistication of medieval military engineering. The emergence of military elites in both Christian and Muslim societies created new social classes whose power derived from their professional military capabilities rather than traditional aristocratic lineages. These warrior classes developed distinctive cultural values, ceremonial practices, and material culture that emphasized martial virtues and collective identity. The creation of military brotherhoods and orders provided institutional frameworks for training, organization, and social advancement that would influence Iberian society for centuries. The agricultural expansion that accompanied territorial conquest required sophisticated colonization programs and settlement policies. The establishment of new towns and villages, the distribution of land to settlers, and the creation of legal frameworks for frontier society demanded administrative capabilities that tested the governing capacity of both Christian and Muslim rulers. The success of these colonization efforts determined the long-term viability of territorial gains and the cultural character of newly settled regions. The commercial networks that connected Iberian territories with the broader Mediterranean and European worlds created unprecedented opportunities for economic growth and cultural exchange. Merchants from Italian city-states, North African kingdoms, and Northern European principalities established trading relationships that brought exotic goods, new technologies, and foreign ideas into the peninsula. These commercial connections also facilitated the movement of people, including scholars, artisans, and religious figures, who contributed to the cultural vitality of both Christian and Muslim societies. The decline of the Cordoban Caliphate began during the reign of Hisham II, who ascended to the throne as a child in 976 and ruled under the regency of his chamberlain Ibn Abi Amir, later known as Al-Mansur. This remarkable figure, whose name means the victorious, would dominate Iberian politics for over 2 decades and achieve military successes that temporarily reversed Christian territorial gains, while simultaneously creating the internal conditions that would lead to the caliphate's eventual collapse. Al-Mansur's rise to power demonstrated both his political acumen and the underlying weakness of the caliphal system. Through careful manipulation of court factions, strategic marriages, and the gradual elimination of potential rivals, he succeeded in concentrating virtually absolute power in his own hands while maintaining the fiction of serving as the young caliph's loyal minister. This constitutional arrangement allowed Al-Mansur to implement radical military and administrative reforms while avoiding direct challenge to established legitimacy. The military campaigns conducted by Al-Mansur between 977 and 1002 represented the most sustained and successful Muslim offensive of the entire Reconquista period. His 57 recorded expeditions penetrated deep into Christian territory, capturing or destroying numerous fortifications and settlements. The sack of Barcelona in 985, the destruction of Leon in 988, and the devastating raid on Santiago de Compostela in 997 demonstrated Muslim military capabilities and temporarily halted Christian territorial expansion. The raid on Santiago de Compostela in particular had enormous psychological and symbolic impact throughout Christian Europe. The destruction of the shrine of St. James, Christianity's premier pilgrimage destination in Iberia, seemed to indicate divine displeasure with Christian efforts and temporarily reduce the flow of pilgrims and resources that had supported Christian expansion. Al-Mansur's decision to spare the tomb itself while destroying the surrounding buildings demonstrated both his military power and his understanding of psychological warfare. The administrative and military reforms implemented by Al-Mansur transformed the structure of the Cordoban state and created new institutions that survived his death. The expansion of the professional army, the recruitment of Berber military units from North Africa, and the development of more efficient taxation systems provided the caliphate with unprecedented military capabilities. However, these reforms also created new sources of internal tension and competition that would contribute to the system's eventual breakdown. The cultural patronage continued under Al-Mansur, despite his preoccupation with military campaigns, maintained Cordoba's position as a center of learning and artistic achievement. The expansion of the Great Mosque, completed during his regency, created one of the largest religious buildings in the Islamic world and demonstrated the continued prosperity and cultural confidence of Al-Andalus. The architectural innovations incorporated into this expansion, including new types of arches and decorative programs, influenced Islamic architecture throughout the medieval period. The death of al-Mansur in 1002 marked the beginning of the end for the Cordoban Caliphate and initiated a period of political fragmentation that would fundamentally alter the balance of power on the Iberian Peninsula. His son Abd al-Malik attempted to continue his father's policies, but lacked the political skill and military genius necessary to maintain the system. The growing tensions between different ethnic groups within the Muslim elite, combined with the financial strains created by constant military campaigning, created conditions for civil war and political collapse. The Christian recovery that began in the early 11th century reflected both the exhaustion of Muslim military capabilities and the institutional strength that Christian kingdoms had developed during their periods of adversity. The reign of Alfonso V of Leon, from 999 to 1028, marked the beginning of renewed Christian expansion and the establishment of more sophisticated governmental institutions. The promulgation of new legal codes, the establishment of urban charters, and the development of more effective military organization provided Christian kingdoms with the administrative capability necessary for sustained territorial expansion. The emergence of Sancho III of Navarre as the dominant figure in Christian Iberia during the early 11th century demonstrated the changing dynamics of Christian politics and the growing importance of the Pyrenean kingdoms. Sancho's control over territories stretching from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean created the most powerful Christian state since the Visigothic period and established the political foundations for future territorial expansion. His administrative reforms, including the introduction of French legal customs and the promotion of Cluniac monastic reform, connected Iberian Christianity more closely to European developments. The cultural and religious reforms promoted by Sancho III of Navarre brought new influences from across the Pyrenees and began the process of integrating Iberian Christianity into the mainstream of European ecclesiastical development. The establishment of Cluniac monasteries, the reform of existing religious institutions, and the promotion of papal authority created new connections between Iberian and international Christianity. These reforms also provided institutional frameworks for future expansion and colonization efforts. The death of Sancho III in 1035 and the division of his territories among his sons created new opportunities and challenges for Christian expansion. The emergence of Castile as an independent kingdom under Ferdinand I established a new power center that would play a crucial role in future Reconquista efforts. The kingdom's strategic position between Leon and Navarre, combined with its aggressive military culture and expanding territorial base, created conditions for sustained eastward and southward expansion. The 12th century dawned with the Christian kingdoms poised to exploit the political fragmentation of Al-Andalus that had resulted from the collapse of the Cordoban Caliphate. The period of the Taifa kingdoms, beginning around 1031, had divided Muslim Iberia into numerous small principalities whose mutual rivalries and military weakness created unprecedented opportunities for Christian territorial expansion. However, the century would also witness two major Islamic revival movements from North Africa that would temporarily halt Christian advances and inject new religious fervor into the struggle for the peninsula. The fragmentation of Muslim power into the Taifa kingdoms represented a fundamental transformation of the political landscape that Christian rulers were quick to exploit. Cities like Toledo, Seville, Granada, Badajoz, and Zaragoza became independent principalities ruled by various ethnic groups including Arabs, Berbers, and Slavs. These kingdoms, while often culturally sophisticated and economically prosperous, lacked the military resources necessary to resist determined Christian attacks and frequently sought survival through paying tribute to Christian rulers. The tribute system that developed during the Taifa period created a complex web of relationships that blurred traditional religious and political boundaries. Christian kings like Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile collected enormous sums from Muslim rulers who preferred to pay for protection rather than face conquest. These tribute payments, known as parias, provided Christian kingdoms with the financial resources necessary for military expansion while also creating economic dependencies that facilitated eventual conquest. Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile, who ruled from 1065 to 1109, emerged as the dominant figure of this period and achieved the most spectacular Christian territorial gains since the initial Muslim conquest. His conquest of Toledo in 1085 marked a turning point in the Reconquista, as it provided Christian forces with a strategic base in the heart of the peninsula and demonstrated that even the most powerful Muslim cities could not resist sustained Christian pressure. The fall of Toledo sent shockwaves throughout Al-Andalus and prompted desperate appeals for assistance from North Africa. The capture of Toledo required sophisticated siege techniques and demonstrated the evolution of Christian military capabilities. The city's powerful fortifications, which had protected it for centuries, were gradually reduced through a combination of direct assault, blockade, and diplomatic pressure applied to the city's Muslim ruler. Alfonso's decision to guarantee the religious and property rights of the city's Muslim and Jewish populations established precedents for future conquests and demonstrated the pragmatic approach that characterized successful Christian expansion. The cultural significance of Toledo's conquest extended far beyond its immediate military value. The city had served as the Visigothic capital, and its recapture carried enormous symbolic weight for Christian ideology. The transformation of the city's great mosque back into a cathedral, while controversial, marked the restoration of Christian authority over one of the peninsula's most important urban centers. The preservation of the city's intellectual life, including its famous translation schools, demonstrated Alfonso's understanding of the value of Islamic learning. The Almoravid intervention that began in 1086 represented the first major attempt by North African Muslims to halt Christian expansion through direct military intervention. The Almoravid movement, which had emerged from the Saharan tribes of Morocco and Mauritania, combined strict Islamic orthodoxy with exceptional military discipline and represented a fundamental challenge to both the Taifa kingdoms and the expanding Christian states. Their crossing into Iberia marked the beginning of a new phase in the Reconquista characterized by intensified religious conflict and external intervention. The Battle of Sagrajas, fought on October 23, 1086, demonstrated the formidable military capabilities of the Almoravid forces and resulted in one of the most devastating defeats suffered by Christian armies during the entire Reconquista period. Alfonso VI's forces, which had grown overconfident from their recent successes against the weak Taifa kingdoms, encountered an enemy unlike any they had previously faced. The Almoravid army, composed of disciplined Berber warriors fighting with religious fervor, employed tactics and equipment that proved devastatingly effective against Christian heavy cavalry. The aftermath of Sagrajas temporarily halted Christian expansion and forced a fundamental reassessment of military strategies and political objectives. The heavy casualties suffered by the Christian nobility, including many of the most experienced military commanders, created a leadership crisis that took years to resolve. However, the Almoravid failure to follow up their victory with sustained offensive operations allowed Christian kingdoms to recover and adapt to the new military realities. The Almoravid occupation of Al-Andalus, completed by 1090, eliminated the Taifa kingdoms and restored Muslim unity under a centralized government based in Marrakesh. This political transformation ended the tribute system that had enriched Christian kingdoms and created a powerful adversary capable of conducting major offensive operations. The Almoravid state combined the military traditions of nomadic Berber society with the administrative expertise of settled Islamic civilization, creating an effective governmental system that could mobilize the resources of both North Africa and Iberia. The cultural impact of Almoravid rule proved as significant as its political and military consequences. The movement's strict interpretation of Islamic law led to the persecution of Christians and Jews who had previously enjoyed relative tolerance under the Taifa rulers. Many members of these communities fled to Christian territories, bringing with them valuable skills, knowledge, and cultural traditions that enriched Christian society. The migration of Mozarabic Christians in particular strengthened the Christian kingdoms while depriving Muslim territories of important economic and intellectual resources. The architectural achievements of the Almoravid period reflected both their military priorities and their cultural ambitions. The construction of new fortifications throughout Al-Andalus created defensive systems capable of resisting Christian siege techniques, while the building of mosques and madrasas demonstrated their commitment to Islamic orthodoxy and education. The distinctive Almoravid architectural style, characterized by geometric decoration and structural innovation, influenced building throughout the Western Mediterranean and established aesthetic traditions that would endure for centuries. The Christian response to the Almoravid challenge involved both military adaptation and diplomatic innovation. The development of new siege techniques, the improvement of heavy cavalry equipment, and the recruitment of foreign military specialists enabled Christian armies to remain competitive despite facing more formidable opposition. The cultivation of relationships with Italian maritime republics, French noble houses, and papal authorities provided Christian kingdoms with external support that proved crucial during periods of crisis. The reign of Alfonso I of Aragon, known as the Battler, from 1104 to 1134, demonstrated the potential for continued Christian expansion despite Almoravid opposition. His conquest of Zaragoza in 1118, after a prolonged siege lasting 8 months, provided Christian forces with a major stronghold in the Ebro Valley and established Aragonese control over one of the peninsula's most important strategic positions. The capture of this city required unprecedented levels of military organization and demonstrated the evolution of Christian siege warfare capabilities. The military orders that emerged during this period provided Christian kingdoms with dedicated military forces specifically organized for frontier warfare against Islamic opponents. The Order of Santiago, founded around 1170, and the Order of Calatrava, established in 1158, combined religious devotion with military service and created institutional frameworks for sustained territorial expansion. These organizations attracted members from throughout Christian Europe and provided professional military capabilities that supplemented royal armies. The economic transformation that accompanied territorial expansion during the 12th century created new sources of wealth and population for the Christian kingdoms. The integration of conquered territories with their agricultural resources, urban centers, and commercial networks generated revenues that supported continued military campaigns. The resettlement of conquered lands with Christian colonists from the north created demographic changes that ensured the permanent integration of new territories into Christian kingdoms. The cultural synthesis that occurred in Christian territories during this period reflected the complex interactions between Christian, Muslim, and Jewish populations. The development of Mudéjar art and architecture, which combined Islamic techniques with Christian themes, created distinctive artistic traditions that flourished throughout the peninsula. The preservation and translation of Arabic scientific and philosophical works in centers like Toledo contributed to the broader European Renaissance and demonstrated the practical benefits of cultural exchange. The Almohad movement, which emerged in Morocco around 1120, represented an even more radical form of Islamic reform than the Almoravids and would pose the greatest threat to Christian expansion during the 12th and early 13th centuries. Founded by Ibn Tumurt, who claimed to be the divinely guided Mahdi, the Almohad movement combined strict monotheistic theology with political revolution and created a powerful state that would dominate both North Africa and Al-Andalus for over a century. The Almohad ideology, with its emphasis on the absolute unity of God and the rejection of all forms of anthropomorphism, represented a theological revolution that challenged established Islamic practices and created new forms of religious authority. The movement's founder developed a sophisticated theological system that drew upon various Islamic traditions while claiming direct divine inspiration. This ideological foundation provided the Almohads with powerful motivation for conquest and conversion that proved highly effective in mobilizing military forces. The Almohad conquest of Al-Andalus, beginning in 1147, eliminated Almoravid rule and created an even more formidable adversary for the Christian kingdoms. The new rulers brought fresh military techniques, greater religious fervor, and more effective administrative systems that revitalized Muslim resistance to Christian expansion. The Almohad army, organized around disciplined tribal units and supported by professional siege engineers, possessed capabilities that surpassed those of any previous Muslim force in Iberia. The Battle of Alarcos, fought on July 19, 1195, demonstrated the military effectiveness of the Almohad forces and resulted in a crushing defeat for the Castilian army of Alfonso VIII. This engagement, which saw the virtual destruction of the Castilian military elite, temporarily halted Christian expansion and forced a fundamental reassessment of military strategies. The psychological impact of this defeat extended throughout Christian Europe and prompted calls for crusading assistance from beyond the Pyrenees. The cultural policies implemented by the Almohads reflected their theological commitments and created significant changes in the social structure of Al-Andalus. The persecution of Christians and Jews who refused conversion forced many members of these communities to emigrate to Christian territories or to practice their religions in secret. The destruction of churches and synagogues, while politically motivated, eliminated architectural monuments that had symbolized religious diversity and cultural synthesis. The architectural achievements of the Almohad period created some of the most magnificent buildings in Islamic Spain and established aesthetic standards that influenced construction throughout the Western Mediterranean. The Giralda Tower in Seville, begun around 1184, exemplified Almohad architectural innovation with its sophisticated structural engineering and elaborate decorative programs. The Kutubiyya Mosque in Marrakesh and the Hassan Tower in Rabat demonstrated the movement's commitment to monumental architecture that would glorify Islamic civilization. The Christian recovery from the defeat at Alarcos demonstrated the resilience and adaptability that had characterized the Reconquista from its beginnings. The reforms implemented by Alfonso VIII of Castile included military reorganization, the strengthening of alliances with other Christian kingdoms, and the cultivation of support from international sources. The granting of municipal charters to frontier towns, the improvement of defensive fortifications, and the recruitment of foreign military specialists all contributed to the restoration of Christian military capabilities. The papal proclamation of crusade status for campaigns against the Almohads marked a new phase in the international character of the Reconquista. Pope Innocent III Bull of 1212 granted the same spiritual rewards to warriors fighting in Iberia as those campaigning in the Holy Land, attracting military volunteers from throughout Europe. This international dimension provided Christian armies with additional manpower and resources while also connecting Iberian warfare to the broader crusading movement. The formation of the Great Coalition that would fight at Las Navas de Tolosa required unprecedented levels of diplomatic coordination and demonstrated the evolution of Christian political cooperation. Alfonso VIII of Castile, supported by Alfonso IX of Leon, Peter II of Aragon, and Sancho VII of Navarre, created a unified command structure that could coordinate the military resources of multiple kingdoms. The participation of foreign crusaders, including French nobility and military orders from beyond the Pyrenees, added international legitimacy and military capability to the Christian cause. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, fought on July 16, 1212, represented the decisive turning point in the medieval struggle between Christianity and Islam in Iberia. The Christian victory, achieved through superior tactical coordination and strategic planning, broke the power of the Almohad army and opened the way for the rapid conquest of most of Al-Andalus. This engagement demonstrated that Christian military capabilities had evolved to the point where they could successfully challenge even the most formidable Muslim opponents. The tactical innovations employed by the Christian commanders at Las Navas de Tolosa reflected years of military experimentation and adaptation. The coordinated use of heavy cavalry, crossbow units, and infantry formations created combined arms capabilities that proved devastatingly effective against Almohad forces. The strategic placement of reserves and the timing of decisive cavalry charges demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of battlefield dynamics that Christian commanders had developed through centuries of frontier warfare. The aftermath of Las Navas de Tolosa created opportunities for territorial expansion that surpassed anything achieved during the previous centuries of the Reconquista. The collapse of Almohad military power eliminated the last effective barrier to Christian advance into southern Iberia and created conditions for the rapid conquest of major Muslim cities. The psychological impact of this victory extended throughout both Christian and Muslim territories, convincing many observers that divine favor had definitively shifted to the Christian cause. The conquest of Córdoba by Ferdinand III of Castile in 1236 marked the capture of the former capital of Islamic Spain and symbolized the reversal of fortunes that had occurred since the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. The fall of this ancient city, which had served as the center of Islamic civilization in Western Europe for over 5 centuries, sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic world and demonstrated the extent of Christian territorial gains. The transformation of the Great Mosque back into a cathedral marked the restoration of Christian authority over one of Islam's most sacred sites in Europe. The administrative challenges created by rapid territorial expansion required sophisticated governmental institutions capable of integrating diverse populations and managing vast territorial conquests. The development of new legal codes, the establishment of municipal governments, and the creation of ecclesiastical structures all contributed to the successful integration of conquered territories. The granting of extensive privileges to settlers willing to colonize frontier regions created incentives for population movement that ensured the demographic transformation of newly conquered lands. The cultural transformation that accompanied the great conquests of the 13th century created new forms of artistic and intellectual expression that reflected the changing character of Iberian society. The construction of new cathedrals in cities like Burgos and Toledo demonstrated the wealth and confidence of Christian civilization while also incorporating architectural techniques and decorative traditions borrowed from Islamic sources. The development of vernacular literature in Castilian, Catalan, and Portuguese, reflected the growing cultural sophistication of Christian societies. The economic prosperity that resulted from territorial expansion provided Christian kingdoms with unprecedented resources for continued military campaigns and cultural development. The integration of the agricultural wealth of Andalusia, the commercial networks of the Mediterranean coast, and the urban industries of major cities created economic foundations that would support the final phases of the Reconquista. The development of new forms of taxation, the regulation of commerce, and the management of currency systems all contributed to the efficient utilization of these expanded resources. The decline of Almohad power in both Al-Andalus and North Africa created opportunities for local rulers to establish independent principalities that would characterize the final phase of Islamic rule in Iberia. The emergence of the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada, founded by Muhammad ibn Nasr in 1238, created the last major Muslim state in the peninsula and established the political framework for the final 2.5 centuries of Islamic presence in Spain. This kingdom, while territorially limited, would achieve remarkable cultural and architectural achievements that would influence Spanish civilization long after its political demise. The Mudéjar populations that remained under Christian rule created new forms of cultural synthesis that enriched Iberian civilization while also creating ongoing challenges for Christian rulers. The integration of Muslim craftsmen, farmers, and merchants into Christian society required sophisticated policies that balanced religious conversion with practical economic needs. The development of Mudéjar art and architecture created distinctive aesthetic traditions that combined Islamic techniques with Christian themes and demonstrated the continuing influence of Islamic culture even under Christian political control. The military orders that had played crucial roles in the Great Conquests began to evolve into major landholding institutions that would influence Iberian society for centuries. The territorial grants made to these organizations in recognition of their military services created vast estates that generated enormous wealth and political influence. The transformation of these military brotherhoods into aristocratic institutions reflected the changing character of frontier society as territorial expansion approached completion in most regions of the peninsula. The 13th century's great conquests had fundamentally altered the balance of power on the Iberian Peninsula, reducing Muslim political control to the mountainous kingdom of Granada in the southeast. As the 14th century dawned, the character of the Reconquista began to evolve from one of rapid territorial expansion to a more complex struggle involving diplomatic maneuvering, internal consolidation, and the gradual erosion of the last major Muslim stronghold. This period would witness the emergence of new challenges for Christian kingdoms, including internal political conflicts, external threats from North Africa, and the complex task of governing increasingly diverse populations. The Kingdom of Granada, established by Muhammad ibn Nasr in 1238, represented a remarkable adaptation to the new political realities created by Christian territorial dominance. Occupying the mountainous region between the Mediterranean coast and the Sierra Nevada, this Muslim state developed sophisticated survival strategies that enabled it to maintain independence for over 2.5 centuries. The kingdom's survival depended upon a complex combination of military skill, diplomatic flexibility, economic prosperity, and the exploitation of conflicts among its Christian neighbors. The geographical advantages that protected Granada from easy conquest included some of the most rugged terrain on the Iberian Peninsula, with mountain passes that could be easily defended and valley systems that provided secure agricultural bases. The kingdom's capital city, situated at the confluence of the Darro and Genil rivers and protected by the Alhambra fortress complex, occupied one of the most naturally defensible positions in medieval Europe. The coastal cities of Malaga and Almeria provided access to Mediterranean trade networks and potential sources of external support. The Nasrid dynasty that ruled Granada developed a political system that balanced the competing demands of survival, prosperity, and Islamic identity. The rulers adopted the title of emir rather than caliph, acknowledging their subordinate position while maintaining religious and political legitimacy within the Islamic world. This pragmatic approach to sovereignty enabled Granada to navigate the complex diplomatic environment of the late medieval period while preserving essential elements of Islamic civilization. The tributary relationship that Granada established with Castile provided the kingdom with a framework for managing its most dangerous neighbor while maintaining nominal independence. The payment of annual tribute, typically consisting of gold from West African trade networks, acknowledged Christian dominance while purchasing security from major military campaigns. This arrangement proved beneficial to both parties, as it provided Castile with regular revenue while allowing Granada to focus its resources on internal development and limited defensive preparations. The cultural flowering that occurred in Granada during the 13th and 14th centuries created some of the most magnificent achievements of Islamic civilization in Europe. The construction of the Alhambra Palace complex, beginning under Muhammad I and continuing under his successors, created architectural masterpieces that synthesized influences from throughout the Islamic world while developing distinctive local characteristics. The palace's innovative use of space, light, and water created environments of unprecedented beauty and sophistication that influenced architectural development throughout Europe. The Court of Lions, completed under Muhammad V in the late 14th century, exemplifies the architectural and artistic achievements of Nasrid Granada. This courtyard, with its intricate stucco decoration, marble columns, and sophisticated hydraulic systems, represents one of the finest examples of Islamic palatial architecture. The integration of poetry into the decorative program, with verses by Ibn Zamrak inscribed on walls and arches, demonstrated the close relationship between literary and architectural expression that characterized Granadan court culture. The intellectual life of Granada during this period attracted scholars, poets, and philosophers from throughout the Islamic world who found refuge from political upheavals in other Muslim territories. The continuation of Arabic literary traditions, the development of new forms of poetry and prose, and the preservation of classical Islamic learning created cultural achievements that influenced intellectual development far beyond the kingdom's borders. The works of figures like Ibn al-Khatib and Ibn Zamrak established Granada as one of the last great centers of Arabic culture in Western Europe. The economic foundation of Granada's prosperity rested upon a combination of agricultural intensification, craft production, and commercial activity that maximized the kingdom's limited territorial resources. The development of sophisticated irrigation systems in the Vega of Granada transformed the fertile plain surrounding the capital into one of the most productive agricultural regions in medieval Europe. The cultivation of silk, sugarcane, and subtropical fruits created export products that generated substantial revenues and supported urban populations. The silk industry that flourished in Granada during this period established the kingdom as one of Europe's major producers of luxury textiles. The cultivation of mulberry trees, the raising of silkworms, and the development of weaving techniques created an integrated industry that employed thousands of workers and generated products renowned throughout the Mediterranean world. The distinctive patterns and colors of Granadan silks influenced fashion and decorative arts throughout Europe and established aesthetic traditions that endured long after the kingdom's conquest. The commercial networks that connected Granada with North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and Northern Europe created economic relationships that transcended religious and political boundaries. Granadan merchants established trading posts in major commercial centers throughout the Mediterranean, while foreign traders maintained permanent communities within the kingdom. These commercial relationships provided Granada with access to exotic goods, precious metals, and technological innovations while also generating customs revenues that supported the royal government. The military organization of Granada reflected the kingdom's defensive priorities and limited territorial resources. Rather than maintaining large standing armies, the Nasrids developed militia systems that could rapidly mobilize the kingdom's population for defensive campaigns while minimizing peacetime military expenses. The construction of an extensive network of watchtowers and signal stations enabled rapid communication across the kingdom's mountainous terrain and provided early warning of Christian military movements. The fortification systems developed by Granada during this period represented some of the most sophisticated military engineering of the medieval period. The integration of castles, walled towns, and frontier strongholds created defensive networks that could channel attacking forces into predetermined areas while providing mutual support among defensive positions. The use of innovative architectural techniques, including bent entrances, multiple defensive lines, and sophisticated siege countermeasures, demonstrated the evolution of military architecture in response to changing siege warfare techniques. Meanwhile, the Christian kingdoms faced their own challenges during the 14th century, including internal political conflicts, economic difficulties, and the need to consolidate their vast territorial conquests. The Crown of Aragon, which had expanded its influence throughout the Mediterranean through conquest and dynastic marriage, struggled to balance competing territorial interests while maintaining effective central control. The kingdom's involvement in Sicily, Sardinia, and other Mediterranean territories created obligations that sometimes conflicted with Iberian interests. The political crisis that afflicted Castile during much of the 14th century reflected the challenges of governing a rapidly expanding kingdom with diverse populations and competing elite interests. The civil war between Peter I and Henry of Trastamara, which raged from 1366 to 1369, demonstrated the fragility of royal authority and the extent to which foreign intervention could influence Iberian politics. The involvement of French and English forces in this conflict connected Castilian internal disputes to the broader European conflicts of the Hundred Years' War. The demographic catastrophe caused by the Black Death, which reached Iberia in 1348, created unprecedented challenges for both Christian and Muslim societies. The massive population losses, estimated at between 1/3 and 1/2 of the peninsula's inhabitants, disrupted economic systems, weakened military capabilities, and created social upheavals that affected every aspect of medieval life. The differential impact of the plague on urban and rural populations, with cities suffering disproportionately heavy losses, altered demographic patterns that had been established over centuries. The economic recovery from the plague's devastation required new approaches to labor management, agricultural production, and urban development. The scarcity of agricultural workers led to significant changes in land tenure systems, with surviving peasants able to negotiate better working conditions and higher wages. The concentration of wealth among plague survivors created opportunities for social advancement while also generating new forms of conspicuous consumption that stimulated craft production and international trade. The cultural and artistic developments that occurred during the 14th century reflected both the challenges and opportunities created by the period's political and social transformations. The emergence of vernacular literature in Castilian, Catalan, and Portuguese created new forms of literary expression that celebrated Christian achievements while also preserving memories of the peninsula's complex cultural heritage. The development of distinctive architectural styles that synthesized influences from throughout Europe with local traditions created buildings that expressed the growing confidence and cultural sophistication of Christian society. The military innovations that emerged during this period reflected the changing nature of warfare and the need to adapt to new tactical and technological developments. The increased use of crossbows, early firearms, and improved siege engines required changes in military organization and training that affected both Christian and Muslim forces. The development of professional military companies, often composed of foreign mercenaries, provided kingdoms with specialized military capabilities while also creating new challenges for maintaining political control over armed forces. The diplomatic revolution that occurred during the 14th century reflected the growing complexity of international relations and the emergence of new forms of interstate communication. The development of permanent diplomatic missions, the codification of diplomatic protocols, and the expansion of treaty-making created institutional frameworks for managing conflicts and coordinating policies among multiple political entities. These diplomatic innovations proved particularly important for Granada, which relied heavily on skillful diplomacy to maintain its independence. The religious developments of this period reflected both continuity with established traditions and adaptation to changing political circumstances. The completion of major cathedral projects in cities like Seville and Toledo created architectural monuments that celebrated Christian victory while also demonstrating the cultural synthesis that had resulted from centuries of intercultural contact. The establishment of new religious orders and the reform of existing institutions reflected ongoing efforts to maintain spiritual vitality within Christian society. The Mudéjar communities that remained under Christian rule continued to play important roles in the economic and cultural life of the Christian kingdoms, while also facing increasing pressure for religious conversion. The development of Mudéjar artistic traditions, particularly in architecture and decorative arts, created distinctive aesthetic expressions that influenced Spanish culture for centuries. However, the gradual erosion of legal protections and the increasing social pressure for conversion created tensions that would eventually contribute to more systematic efforts at forced assimilation. The rise of anti-Semitic sentiment during the 14th century created new challenges for Jewish communities that had previously enjoyed relative security under Christian rule. The massacre of Jews in Seville in 1391 and similar violence in other cities reflected growing social tensions and economic competition that would ultimately lead to more systematic persecution. The conversion of many Jews to Christianity during this period created new social categories and religious tensions that would influence Iberian society for centuries. The territorial consolidation efforts undertaken by the Christian kingdoms during this period reflected the need to create more effective administrative systems for governing their vast conquests. The establishment of new legal codes, the standardization of administrative procedures, and the creation of more efficient taxation systems all contributed to the development of more centralized governmental institutions. These administrative innovations provided the foundation for the more systematic approach to territorial expansion that would characterize the final phase of the Reconquista. The maritime expansion that began during the 14th century created new opportunities for territorial conquest and economic development that would ultimately transform the character of Iberian civilization. The Castilian conquest of the Canary Islands, beginning in 1402, provided experience in overseas colonization and established precedents for later Atlantic expansion. The development of new navigational techniques and shipbuilding technologies created capabilities that would enable the remarkable voyages of discovery that would follow the completion of the Reconquista. The economic transformation that occurred during the late 14th century laid the groundwork for the financial resources that would be necessary for the final conquest of Granada. The development of new banking systems, the expansion of international trade, and the exploitation of precious metal resources from overseas territories all contributed to the accumulation of wealth that could support sustained military campaigns. The integration of Castile and Aragon through dynastic marriage would eventually create the unified monarchy that would possess the resources necessary to complete the centuries-long struggle. The cultural synthesis that had emerged from centuries of intercultural contact reached new levels of sophistication during the 14th century, creating artistic and intellectual traditions that would influence European development for centuries. The preservation and transmission of classical knowledge, the development of new forms of artistic expression, and the creation of distinctive cultural institutions all contributed to achievements that transcended religious and political boundaries. These cultural developments would provide important foundations for the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration that would follow the completion of the Reconquista. The Hundred Years' War between England and France created new opportunities for Iberian kingdoms to play important roles in European politics while also creating challenges from foreign military intervention. The involvement of Castilian and Aragonese forces in French conflicts provided military experience and international connections that strengthened Iberian political influence. However, these foreign entanglements also diverted resources and attention from the ongoing struggle with Muslim Granada and sometimes created conflicts of interest that complicated domestic policy. The papal schism that divided Western Christianity during the late 14th and early 15th centuries created additional challenges for Iberian kingdoms, while also providing opportunities for increased political autonomy. The competing claims of rival popes forced Christian rulers to choose sides in ecclesiastical conflicts that had significant political implications. The eventual resolution of the schism through the Council of Constance strengthened papal authority, while also establishing precedents for conciliar involvement in church governance that would influence religious development throughout Europe. The technological innovations that emerged during the 14th century, particularly in military engineering and navigation, would prove crucial for the final phases of the Reconquista and the subsequent overseas expansion. The development of improved cannon technology, better fortification techniques, and more sophisticated siege engines created military capabilities that would eventually overcome even the most formidable defensive positions. The advancement of navigational instruments, cartographic techniques, and shipbuilding methods created the technological foundations for the Age of Exploration. The social transformations that occurred during this period reflected both the disruptions caused by plague and warfare and the opportunities created by territorial expansion and economic growth. The emergence of new social classes, the modification of traditional feudal relationships, and the development of more complex urban societies all contributed to the evolution of Iberian civilization. These social changes would provide important foundations for the more centralized monarchical systems that would emerge during the 15th century and enable the completion of the Reconquista. The 15th century dawned with the Iberian Peninsula poised for the final resolution of a conflict that had defined its character for nearly 8 centuries. The Kingdom of Granada, while still maintaining its independence through diplomatic skill and military resilience, faced increasingly powerful Christian neighbors whose growing unity and resources would ultimately prove insurmountable. The century would witness the dynastic union of Castile and Aragon, the development of new military technologies, and the culmination of centuries of territorial expansion with the fall of Granada in 1492, marking not only the end of Muslim political power in Iberia, but also the beginning of Spain's emergence as a global imperial power. The internal dynamics of Granada during the 15th century reflected both the kingdom's remarkable cultural achievements and the growing pressures that would ultimately lead to its downfall. The Nasrid dynasty continued to rule from the magnificent Alhambra Palace, where successive emirs patronized literature, art, and scholarship while managing the complex challenges of governing a small Muslim state surrounded by increasingly powerful Christian neighbors. The kingdom's survival strategies, refined over 2 centuries of precarious independence, would be tested to their limits during this final phase of its existence. The reign of Yusuf III, from 1408 to 1417, marked one of the last periods of relative stability and prosperity for Granada. His diplomatic skills enabled him to maintain peaceful relations with Castile while pursuing internal development projects that strengthened the kingdom's defensive capabilities and economic foundations. The completion of major architectural projects in the Alhambra, including refinements to the Palace of the Lions and the construction of new residential quarters, demonstrated the continued vitality of Granadan court culture even under increasing external pressure. The succession crises that plagued Granada during the mid-15th century reflected both the limitations of the Nasrid political system and the growing influence of external powers in the kingdom's internal affairs. The rivalry between different branches of the royal family created opportunities for Castilian intervention and gradually weakened the kingdom's ability to present a unified response to external threats. These internal divisions would prove crucial in facilitating the eventual Christian conquest, as competing Granadan factions sought foreign support against their domestic rivals. The rise of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon as joint monarchs marked the beginning of the political unification that would provide the resources and determination necessary for the final conquest of Granada. Their marriage in 1469 created a dynastic union that combined the military traditions of Castile with the Mediterranean commercial networks of Aragon, while also bringing together the institutional innovations and administrative expertise that both kingdoms had developed during centuries of territorial expansion and governmental evolution. The Catholic monarchs, as Isabella and Ferdinand came to be known, brought to their joint rule a shared commitment to religious orthodoxy and territorial unification that would profoundly influence the character of their policies toward Granada. Their vision of a unified Christian Spain left no room for the continued existence of an independent Muslim state, while their growing confidence in their military capabilities made the conquest of Granada seem both feasible and inevitable. The decade-long Granada War, beginning in 1482, represented the final chapter of the Reconquista and demonstrated the evolution of medieval warfare through the systematic application of artillery, professional military organization, and sophisticated logistical planning. The Catholic monarch's approach to the conquest reflected lessons learned from centuries of frontier warfare, while also incorporating new technologies and tactical innovations that would influence European military development for centuries to come. The underlying causes of the Granada War extended beyond simple territorial ambition to encompass religious ideology, economic considerations, and dynastic prestige. The Catholic monarchs viewed the existence of Granada as an affront to Christian unity and a potential source of support for Ottoman expansion into the Western Mediterranean. The kingdom's wealth, derived from its agricultural productivity and commercial networks, provided additional incentives for conquest, while the successful completion of the Reconquista would enhance royal prestige and demonstrate divine approval for their rule. The immediate trigger for the war came from a succession dispute within Granada that provided the Catholic monarchs with opportunities for intervention. The conflict between Muley Hassan and his son Boabdil created competing factions that sought external support, enabling Christian forces to exploit internal divisions while gradually reducing the kingdom's ability to mount unified resistance. This pattern of exploiting internal conflicts had characterized Christian expansion for centuries, but would prove particularly effective against the weakened and divided Granadan state. The Siege of Alhama in 1482 marked the beginning of systematic Christian operations against Granada and demonstrated the sophisticated military capabilities that the Catholic monarchs had developed. The capture of this strategically important fortress, accomplished through the coordinated use of artillery and professional infantry, provided Christian forces with a secure base for further operations while also demonstrating their ability to overcome even the most formidable Granadon defenses. The military innovations employed during the Granada War reflected the transformation of medieval warfare through the application of gunpowder technology and professional military organization. The systematic use of cannon to breach city walls, the coordination of artillery with infantry assaults, and the development of new fortification techniques to counter gunpowder weapons all contributed to the evolution of military science that would influence European warfare for centuries. The creation of professional military units, including specialized artillery crews and engineering companies, provided the Catholic monarchs with capabilities that no previous Christian force had possessed. The siege of Malaga in 1487 demonstrated both the effectiveness of Christian military innovations and the desperate resistance that Granadon forces could still mount when properly organized and motivated. The prolonged siege, lasting over 3 months, required the full resources of the United Christian Kingdoms and showcased the logistical capabilities that had been developed to support sustained military operations. The eventual surrender of the city provided the Christians with Granada's principal port and eliminated the kingdom's primary connection to potential North African allies. The economic warfare employed by the Catholic monarchs during the Granada War reflected sophisticated understanding of the kingdom's vulnerabilities and the importance of systematic economic pressure in achieving military objectives. The disruption of agricultural production through the destruction of crops and irrigation systems, the blockade of commercial routes, and the prevention of tribute payments to North African allies all contributed to the gradual weakening of Granadon resistance capabilities. The cultural impact of the Granada War extended far beyond its immediate military objectives to encompass broader questions of religious identity and social organization. The systematic destruction of Islamic architectural monuments, the forced conversion of Muslim populations, and the elimination of Arabic cultural institutions all reflected the Catholic monarch's commitment to creating a unified Christian society. These policies would have profound implications for Spanish cultural development and would influence approaches to religious and ethnic diversity for centuries to come. The diplomatic isolation of Granada during the final years of the war reflected both the effectiveness of Christian diplomacy and the changing international situation in the Mediterranean. The preoccupation of the Ottoman Empire with Eastern European expansion, the weakness of North African states, and the general European support for the Christian conquest all contributed to Granada's inability to secure meaningful external assistance. This diplomatic isolation made the kingdom's military situation hopeless and encouraged internal factions to seek accommodation with the conquerors. The siege of Baza in 1489 marked another crucial phase in the systematic reduction of Granadon strongholds and demonstrated the persistence and resources that the Catholic monarchs were willing to commit to their conquest. The capture of this important fortress, which controlled access to the eastern regions of the kingdom, required innovative siege techniques and demonstrated the continuous evolution of military technology and tactics during the campaign. The final siege of Granada, beginning in 1491, represented the culmination of decades of careful planning and systematic territorial reduction. The construction of the siege city of Santa Fe, designed to house the Christian army during the extended blockade, demonstrated the methodical approach that characterized the Catholic monarch's military operations. This permanent siege encampment, built according to regular geometric principles and equipped with all necessary facilities for a prolonged campaign, reflected both the determination to achieve complete victory and the confidence in ultimate success. The surrender negotiations that led to the capitulations of Granada in November 1491 reflected both the hopeless military situation of the Muslim kingdom and the Catholic monarch's desire to achieve victory with minimal additional costs. The terms offered to Boabdil and his subjects included guarantees of religious freedom, protection of property rights, and preservation of Islamic legal traditions that seemed to promise a relatively smooth transition to Christian rule. However, these agreements would prove to be temporary expedients that would be systematically undermined in subsequent years. The ceremonial surrender of Granada on January 2, 1492, marked the end of nearly 8 centuries of Muslim political presence in Iberia and completed the longest territorial conquest in European history. The symbolic transfer of the keys of the Alhambra from Boabdil to the Catholic monarchs represented not only a military victory but also the fulfillment of a religious mission that had sustained Christian expansion for generations. The event was celebrated throughout Christian Europe as a triumph of faith over infidelity, and as divine validation of Christian supremacy. The immediate aftermath of Granada's conquest revealed both the opportunities and challenges created by the completion of the Reconquista. The integration of Granada's population, estimated at between 200,000 and 300,000 inhabitants, required administrative innovations and social policies that would test the governmental capabilities of the United Monarchy. The treatment of Granada's Muslim population would establish precedents for Spanish approaches to religious and ethnic diversity that would influence imperial policies throughout the early modern period. The architectural preservation and modification of Islamic monuments in Granada reflected the complex attitudes of the conquerors toward their new subjects' cultural heritage. While many mosques were converted to churches and Islamic decorative elements were modified or destroyed, the Catholic monarchs also recognized the artistic and practical value of existing buildings and infrastructure. The preservation of the Alhambra as a royal residence demonstrated appreciation for Islamic architectural achievements while also symbolizing the transformation of Muslim political power into Christian authority. The economic integration of Granada into the broader Spanish economy created new opportunities for development while also generating tensions that would persist for generations. The kingdom's agricultural wealth, particularly its silk production and subtropical crops, provided valuable additions to Spanish economic resources. However, the disruption of traditional economic relationships and the gradual marginalization of Muslim merchants and craftsmen created social problems that would require ongoing governmental attention. The religious policies implemented in Granada after 1492 revealed the tension between the pragmatic terms of surrender and the ideological commitments of the Catholic monarchs. The initial tolerance promised in the capitulations gradually gave way to more systematic pressure for conversion as royal priorities shifted toward the creation of religious uniformity. The appointment of Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros as Archbishop of Toledo in 1495 marked the beginning of more aggressive efforts to promote Christian conversion and eliminate Islamic religious practices. The Mudéjar revolts of 1499 to 1501 demonstrated both the resistance of Granada's Muslim population to forced conversion and the determination of the Catholic monarchs to achieve religious uniformity. These uprisings, concentrated in the Alpujarras Mountains southeast of Granada, required military suppression and marked the end of the relatively tolerant policies that had characterized the immediate post-conquest period. The defeat of these revolts provided justification for the complete abandonment of the capitulations and the implementation of systematic conversion policies. The creation of the Spanish Inquisition and its extension to Granada reflected the broader transformation of Spanish society toward religious orthodoxy and social control. The investigation of converted Muslims, known as Moriscos, for evidence of continued Islamic practices created a climate of suspicion and persecution that would persist for over a century. These policies not only affected Granada's population but also established institutional frameworks that would influence Spanish religious and social policies throughout the empire. The completion of the Reconquista created new possibilities for overseas expansion that would transform Spain into a global imperial power. The military experience gained during centuries of frontier warfare, the administrative innovations developed for governing diverse populations, and the religious ideology that had sustained territorial expansion all provided foundations for the conquest and colonization of the Americas. The year 1492 thus marked not only the end of one historical era, but also the beginning of another that would have even more profound global implications. Christopher Columbus's voyage to the Americas, funded by the wealth and confidence generated by the conquest of Granada, established the connection between the completion of the Reconquista and the beginning of Spanish imperial expansion. The same ideological commitments, military techniques, and administrative systems that had enabled the conquest of Muslim Iberia would be applied to the subjugation and colonization of indigenous American populations. The experience of managing religious and ethnic diversity in Granada would inform Spanish colonial policies throughout the New World. The cultural synthesis that had emerged from 8 centuries of intercultural contact in Iberia provided Spain with unique capabilities for governing diverse populations and adapting to different environments. The architectural techniques, agricultural knowledge, and administrative practices developed during the Reconquista period would prove invaluable for colonial expansion and settlement. The preservation and transmission of this cultural heritage, despite official policies promoting religious uniformity, created distinctive Spanish cultural characteristics that would influence global development. The completion of the Reconquista marked the end of one of the longest and most significant conflicts in European history, while also establishing the foundations for Spain's emergence as the dominant global power of the 16th century. The 8 centuries of struggle between Christian and Muslim forces had created institutional innovations, cultural syntheses, and ideological frameworks that would profoundly influence not only Spanish development but also the broader course of world history. The fall of Granada thus represents both the culmination of medieval Iberian development and the beginning of the early modern era of global expansion and cultural transformation.